Make a start and say welcome to everybody, whether it's good morning, good afternoon or good evening, depending on which part of the world you are. My name is Katie Taylor. I'm the Vice Chair at the Agile Business Consortium. And we've been around for over 25 years now and are the professional body for business agility. So we're hosting a whole series of events over the month of February as part of the wider Agile20Reflect festival. So we're very pleased to be part of that, and I'm sure you've all had a look at the various things that are going on there. So a huge response to that particular festival. So today, very pleased to have with us Rod Willis, and having seen a little sneak preview of what he's got in store for us, I'm sure we're all in for a very entertaining session. So without further ado, I'm going to pass across to Rod to make a start. Thank you, Rod.
Thanks, Katie. When you said that, it made me feel like I should get my top hat and tails out and a cane. That never was a good dancer, however. Okay. So good morning, folks. Thanks for joining. Give you a brief background. I've spent many years in sort of high-tech corporate in the world of electronic manufacturing, primarily in engineering and managerial roles. But as I reflected over that career period, I realized, what was the one gift you could give someone in their early career, if only you could? And that was the classic question I asked myself: what could I have given my 25-year-old self that would have made life more effective in terms of the contribution in the workplace? And ultimately, it came down to the essence of collaboration at that time. And if I go back to when I was 25, online wasn't quite so hot as it is now, or capable. But actually, I think what's happening now, it's really become the essence of online collaboration. What does it really take to collaborate? So I'm going to share with you a few things this morning, and we'll have a little bit of interaction. And we'll be actually modeling some of the things we'll be talking about as well. So there is method in my madness. Some people question that, but I assure you there is a bit of logic behind it. So what I'd like to do is let's go to the next slide, if I can. Here we go. And one of the great questions I think comes to mind is, where do we start? Whatever we're trying to learn, there's going to be a Monday morning somewhere, generally the following week. So now the question is, so what do we do differently? But before we look at what we do differently, it's quite interesting to know, but what do we do now? And what I mean by that, you may have come across a tool called Mentimeter before. And what I'm going to ask you to do, some of you may have menti.com as an app on your phones. If you have, that's great. And if you're familiar with it, then I'd recommend you use that. But if you haven't, then you've got a couple of choices. And this is going to be a very quick interaction between us. And we'll share the results for everyone within the group. So as I go to this larger screen, it will come through to you any second. There's a little bit of a lag. Here we go. You've got a choice. You can either go to menti.com in your browser and type in this code, 2883381. Or if your camera supports it, if you have a QR code reader, just take your phone and point it at this QR code and it'll take you to the URL. But the other thing I'm going to do, I'm going to send that URL directly to the chat room. So let me just go and get it, which means that you can just click on it. So let's go to chat. So it's coming through now. And if you just click on this link, what you will find is the ability to enter 3 words. And for those of you feeling really generous, you can enter more than 3, but as in you submit it and then you can repeat entering those words. But the purpose of the words, let me now go to what we're trying to look at. And what we're trying to say is, as you consider early Monday morning, so you're on your way to work, and now think of a group that you want to reflect upon. So it could be the one that you're about to join. Group or team in this situation. Imagine group and team are the same thing for this instance. What emotions come to mind? So you're thinking about Monday morning, you're on the way to work. Maybe it's from the kitchen now to the home office, but you're on the way to work. And what emotions come to mind? And if you wouldn't mind just typing in a few words that reflect for you what's coming to mind. Now I can see on my screen some things popping up and I'll share that later on. So we'll keep that going for a bit. Okay, I'm now going to see if I can share that screen live, Katie.
We can see it. We can see it now.
Oh,
Or
okay.
I can see it.
Let me just. Oh yes, you should be able to. That's good. So we've got a mixture of some sort of, if I go at a simplistic language level, some very positive language. There's a few challenging words in there as well. And I think what that is capturing, isn't it interesting? You know, tired, that's center stage, how fascinating that is. And by definition, those of you who may not be familiar with word clouds, the larger word and the word in the middle is the one that has been appearing most from this group. So in some respects, isn't that interesting? Now imagine what that means for you as an individual and your ability to contribute to a team. And if you put this in the context of Agile20Reflect, you know, the world of Agile has generally a very strong positive outlook on life about enablement, supportive cultures. All collaborative has sort of taken over tired, so that's interesting. And I think this dynamic exchange, in some respects, you could even take it as a metaphor for what actually happens to us, each of us individually. That we go through the day and our emotions shift. They are dynamic. We don't have, I'm collaborative today and I don't change. Well, actually, there'll be a time when, nice word here, apprehension pops up, or I feel tired, excited, fearful, very much dependent on the people you're working with and the organization you will be in. This leads me to what will be the follow-on area. We'll come back to that. If you're still typing, feel free. We won't lose that data. What I will do, though, I will just take a quick screen capture of it where it is. I'll be able to get to the total data later on. And Katie, I'll be happy to share that with the rest of the group if they're interested in having that.
Okay.
Let's come back to here now. So what are we going to cover in this session? Thank you, by the way, for engaging. And I'll highlight why we did that, apart from its interesting information to gather from the group. We want to share with you what we believe are 5 essential elements of collaboration. I've got here 30 minutes of sharing. This is where I'm primarily going to just share with you. So it's going to be a little bit of a one way. I'll just be sharing information that I think would be really helpful for people to know about if they're not already familiar with it. What we'll then do is we'll do a little bit of testing. And this is where, as a whole group, we're going to be able to engage in a very quick, it's about 5 minutes, online questionnaire. But the important piece is we'll be able to see the total results as a group interactively and then discuss what those results are sharing with us and explore any potential implications. So that's what we're going to do this morning. So what are the 5 essential elements? The first one is, do we have an understanding of the process of forming relationships? And we'll go into that in a little more detail. The next is, are we consciously aware of how we can look at the quantity, but also the quality of relationships? It's really interesting. I find some people have explored quantity, but not necessarily quality. And then how can you define that? You know, what does quality mean when you come to the word of relationships? Different levels of psychological safety. Some of you would have probably come across the term psychological safety, but there's some more recent work, and there's a particular book I'll recommend to you. By the way, I'm not the author of it. It's an American author, but I strongly recommend that to you, and I'll share that later on. Our personal relationship with technology. So we added at the beginning, you know, the importance of the essence of high-performing teams. Yeah, what does it take? Also online of collaboration. Then we added the word online. But if you're going online, you can't go online unless you've got specific technology, which we're using today. Some of you may have presented quite a lot using Zoom. Some may have only been watching. And if someone said tomorrow, oh, by the way, could you please present something on Zoom and you hadn't done that before, it would not be unreasonable to feel quite anxious because you're not familiar with it. So our relationship with technology and how familiar we are with it is quite an important point as well. And then the final point I want to make, and many years ago, I actually did practitioner research or evidence-based research into this area. Resistance to change and mindsets. What's actually going on when we say people are resistant to change, and what allows us to actually believe someone else is resistant? And what's the implication of that? And I looked at my own career, I looked at some of the research I've been involved in directly, but then also other people's research. And it seemed to me that these 5 elements capture at a meta level, the main areas that if only we could pay attention to these, we might actually have more effective online collaboration. And there's some tremendous positive initiatives coming out now. And those initiatives, you'll be able to identify 1 or 2 or maybe even 3 of these. Rarely will you see all 5 together. And my proposition to you is each is equally important, but they all interact with each other. So as soon as you say, I'm going to focus on this one, that's fine for the learning objective. But operationally, if you only focus on one, know that one of the other 4 are likely to get in your way without you knowing. So that's why we've got this approach to say, well, there are 5 things. And Edward Deming, if any of you have come across Edward Deming's work, he many years ago introduced a framework, actually in his last book, called the SOPK framework, or it was actually the System of Profound Knowledge. And he made a very important point. He said, if you know these domains that he's referring to, it's not that you have to be expert in every one of them, but it really helps if you realize they exist, because then you can hold the question, I think I might have something happening in this area. Do I know enough about it? Well, no. Well, if you know it exists, you can go and dig and ask someone or learn. But if you don't know it exists, you don't know to ask the question. So this is about hopefully sharing 5 signposts to say each of these are actually very important topics, and engage with them as is appropriate for your context and for your own learning journeys. So let's dig down a bit. So the process of forming relationships. Most of our education systems focus on the individual. Rarely is there a collective. Now, maybe when you get into postgrad work, there's some group work and group assessment, but everyone sighs of relief when they get back down to individual assessment, because I'm being judged on what I do. And we've actually been taught the I word so strongly throughout our entire education that actually it becomes quite difficult for some people to learn that we can be quite interesting. And when you get into the group space, there is a relationship component. And do we know how to look at that? In the main, some know how to do it intuitively, but they may not have the language to express the structure. Here, you can't read the words very easily. I'll read them out. These have the same words, these 2 objects. This first circle is inclusion. The second is control. The third is openness. Now, this comes from the work of putting together high-performing crew, actually, in nuclear subs in the 50s. It's what the Marine Corps used to use to select the right combination of Marines to go into a nuclear sub for 6 months under the surface of the water. And it's a bit of a gift, really, because the early version was actually available in the public domain. And what we have is, the first thing we did this morning, we did our welcomes and introductions, and then we solicited your input through the Monday morning question. That is actually an inclusion step. So we've actually modeled inclusion, which is you're invited to be included. Now, you can always say, I don't want to be, and that's a personal choice, and that's fine. But if you're invited and you're here, you think, well, okay, that's fine. I feel a little bit more welcomed now. Control is about feeling not in control of others, but just I don't feel threatened. This space is okay. And depending on what the task is in hand, that will be a very dynamic relationship. But this is about, do things feel in control to the extent that I am not fearful, be it psychologically or physically. And then if you have inclusion and then you move to this question of control, then openness tends to occur. People are prepared to open up more than others. We've all experienced that in lives. But you have this loop, inclusion, control, and openness loop. And it starts off fairly small in the beginning. And then guess what? Once you've got inclusion, control, openness going, then you move to another level of inclusion, control, and openness, and the thing can build. And if you're really lucky, you move to highly effective teams. Imagine you've got a number of people in a group. They all feel included. The control balance, the power balance is comfortable. No one's overwhelming anyone else. And the group becomes very open with each other. However, unfortunately, the typical group sort of plateaus. You get basic relationships in place. Now, I would argue really effective Agile teams that are truly operating as they are designed to are in the effective group. But most groups and teams tend to operate in a bit of a, well, we know each other and that's okay, and we get on and do things. And we'll be able to look at the quality of relationships shortly, which will help us understand also the difference between these two scales, or these two pathways. But unfortunately, there's also a bunch of groups and teams that end up in the dysfunctional space. And that's where if you come across a team or group and it's working fine, but there's one person that doesn't quite fit for whatever reason, and it's not a judgment per se on that individual, but the chemistry is not right, then you have potentially a dysfunctional group. Now, I've come across many managers in my past career. I now get involved in coaching as well, so in this space as well, where people seem to be quite nervous and hesitant to deal with dysfunctional groups because they're potentially concerned about the conflict that they have to face, and especially a young manager, because they haven't yet learned maybe some of the people skills that are necessary. And this comes back down to the issue of we don't necessarily have a way of looking at relationships. But if you just hold in mind, every relationship starts, and this is only a structure, therefore it's not the full answer, but is someone included? Importantly, do they feel included? Is the relationship around control comfortable and how people would expect without being subservient or in control of someone else? And is openness in play? Some of this comes in our everyday language. You have a classic case of that person's not being very open. Well, immediately we know this already. We may not know it's in this structure, but we know that word. Oh, they're not being open with me. Or we tend to hear this language more at school, but by the way, it equally applies in the adult world. We just don't say it much. They didn't include me. In the adult world, we tend to hear of micromanagement. Now, that's very much a control topic. Most people who are being micromanaged do not like being, that control. Now, why is that person controlling the others? There's something going on for that individual. So know that the inclusion, control, and openness, when you know it, it's like, oh, that's sort of, I can understand that because it fits with most people's everyday knowledge. Quantity and quality of relationships. So most of you who've looked at numbers of groups will be familiar with this. So what we have, the blue is number of people. So 1 person, 2, 3, all the way up to 20. And then the number of connections. So if you have 2 people, you have 1 connection. If you have 3 people, you have 3 connections. If you have 4 people, you have 6 connections suddenly, if you take a line between each person. And so here you just got the formula. So if you have I love this. So the other day someone said, oh, we've got a team of 20. Oh, okay, I'm sure that's working well. Team of 20, 190 relationships. Each one will have an efficacy around its quality. Now, okay, is that just a group of 20 people? They don't all need to interact. That's fine. But if you now come down to, I would really like to create an effective online collaborative group. How big is that group? How many relationships? And are you taking these things into account? So this is a quantity issue. And those who like their formulas, if you're not familiar with it, that's your formula. It's frightening how quickly it grows. And often, again, someone's involved in is doing an online collaboration environment, and they have got 100 members, and they're wondering why some people aren't connecting with each other. It's because the technology can do it. That's fine. But are the people ready to do it? Do they know how to do it and frame it? Now, let's look at how you can look at the quality. Now, this is inspired by Edgar Schein. He's an occupational psychologist. He's got a brilliant book called Humble Leadership. In fact, this is the second book I'm going to recommend. If you're not familiar with Humble Leadership and Edgar Schein's work, I strongly recommend it. But what he does is he introduces a very simple 4-level categorization. And let me go to a visual representation of this. What we have here, -1, dysfunctional relationship. These people are just not working with each other for whatever reason. They're meant to be in this particular context, but they're not working. So you have this gap. Typical team member is, well, as long as they're doing what I need them to do and I'm doing what they need them to do, we're okay, but we don't really care for each other. That's a classic +1 relationship. It's a pure functional one. Effective teams, however, come into play when it's more of a +2. Now, +2 is where there's actually a level of care. I really get on with this person and they get on with me. We understand each other, and therefore we work together really well. And if I or they were to leave, the other person would feel a bit disappointed. Oh, that's a shame. I really got on well with that person. A +3 is where the high performance comes in, and that's where we really care for each other. And in a sports sense, there's a saying, it may not translate internationally, but there's a saying, they took one for the team. You can imagine this maybe in rugby, where a defender positions himself to be the blocker and he gets absolutely pummeled to enable his colleague to carry on, or his teammate to carry on running with the ball. And that's taking one for the team. You really care for the other players, and you're prepared to sacrifice aspects of your own self in support of the team. What you'll find, though, unfortunately, is the majority of organizations have a typical team of +1s, and some have -1s in the mix in terms of the relationships. So this is relationship between each individual. And if you want to assess your own relationship, put yourself, draw a circle, put your initials in it, draw links out to the people that you relate to. You can do this in any context, but I recommend the work context. And then just put the initial of the people you're thinking of, and then just score it. Is it a -1, a +1, a +2, or a +3? What you may well find is that there could be a -1 relationship that you're currently ignoring that's actually quite important to what you want to do. And if that is the case, then you know you've got a very clear objective. How can I get the -1 relationship to a +1? Note, we're not judging another person, we're assessing the relationship space, because the relationship space is mutually created by two parties. So it's not a judgment on the other individual. It's a judgment on the space between two individuals. Far better made by the people in the mix. And if you go to like an Agile group, and if you think it's a high-performing group, you could be able to do this together. What are our relationship structures? Where are there the +1s, the +2s, the +3s? Because +1s, 2s, and 3s, none of them are in of themselves better. It depends what you want to achieve. You may just want a typical team, and that might be okay. I would suggest to you, though, in the Agile world, you sort of need an effective team, because the nature of Agile requires people to, I would suggest, to caring for each other rather than a pure functional relationship. Moving on, different psychological levels in terms of, sorry, psychology safety. I'm confusing my frameworks here. Amy Edmondson, some of you would have come across. She has a definition, a belief that one will not be punished or humiliated for speaking up. The what I've come across more recently, a condition in which human beings feel included. Notice the word included. This did not come from the same theory base of the relationship forming, but it's a human thing. It's safe to learn, it's safe to contribute, and it's safe to challenge the status quo, all without fear of being embarrassed, marginalized, or punished. Timothy Clark is the originator of that quote, and this is the book I recommend, which is The 4 Stages of Psychological Safety. Actually, I think my blurring system is blurring it out for you. So it only came out this year. It's an easy read, but very potent. And he relates his experience to working in a steel foundry where someone got crushed, and then he realized maybe there is an important thing here to communication, because otherwise people can lose their lives in that setting. He introduces a framework where there's a line here, the inclusion threshold. So at this point before, you're excluded, but then you are included. And the question is, do you feel safe and included? Sometimes you're included because you're going to be the full person. Guess what? That you're not going to feel safe. Are you included safely? Is it safe to learn? Is it safe to say, I don't know? Sorry, I don't know that bit. Can you help me? Or can you point to me someone who can? The contributor. So you feel, you know, you're included, you know that it's a learning space, you can highlight any issues you need support on, but you can now contribute and you feel safe to contribute. Another term that often is spoken about in the UK, don't put your head above the parapet because it gets chopped off. Now, again, I don't know if that translates, but the point is, you know, let's shoot the messenger. Not necessarily the most effective technique in life, but it happens time and time again. You can go to the next stage, which is the challenger. They're saying, you know, what we're doing doesn't actually make sense, or we could do it better, we can do more effective. And this is called the innovation threshold. Now, this is all about, you know, effective online collaboration. I would argue that the sweet spot, the ideal space to get to here is this one, the contributor. Because the challenger has a tendency to want to innovate. Let's introduce new systems, or we can do that. We can put something else in, or something else. That's brilliant, but you'll find other people are still coming up this pathway. So there's an issue here. If you look at this as a pathway, and that we all travel up it, Now the question is, do we all travel at the same speed within the same group? And I would suggest we don't. So now there's an issue of pacing. Where are your peers in your group in this journey? And are we all at the contributor space? Now, this is not to say don't challenge. It's to know when challenge is productive. There's a time when challenge can be counterproductive. I know that from my personal experience because I've been a challenger all my years. And when you put me in a high growth environment, that's wonderful. But if you're now in a nice sustaining environment, it's actually not necessarily what you want. But if it's part of your character, it becomes very difficult to stay motivated and not challenge. Again, yeah, in this space, hopefully challenge for positive intent. So contributor is where we'd like to be. Personal relationships with technology. Again, this model may be familiar to some, but not to others. When you look at systems, information systems, you always have some kind of enabling technology. You always have some kind of process, and you always have some kind of team, or could be an individual. In the most basic form, this is a piece of paper and a pencil. This is a person taking notes with that paper and pencil. And this is the person themselves. Now, do they know what notes to take? Depends on their training and knowledge. But when you have the enabling technology, the team members, and the business processes aligned, then you have the highest potential of success, or the highest capability of success. Now, we're going to be focusing on this space. There's a lot of work that happens in these outer areas, and I think you've got some great technology solutions out there. Zoom is one of many ways of having this type of exchange. If we didn't have this type of technology, we wouldn't be having this meeting. So this is not to say these are not important. These are essential, hence the word enabling technology. But technology exists to help people do things. Now the question is, what is it we're trying to do? Well, that's a function of the business process. And do people know how to do it? And by the way, do they feel fearful of doing it? Do they feel fearful of working with their teammates? I know of an organization that put in a sales forecasting system. And when they put that in, suddenly transparency was there. Unfortunately, none of the salespeople wanted transparency. So guess what you had for about 3 years? About 3 years of what's called sandbagging, where people were finding ways of putting information in that made it look like they were entering data into the system appropriately, but just enough to keep their head below the parapet to carry on doing what they wanted to do, which is to succeed and fail without people realizing what was going on. Obviously, when they succeeded, they shouted, and when they failed, they kept it very quiet. If you have a full transparent forecasting system with a sales team, people have to feel comfortable to say, do you know that deal? It didn't come in. I couldn't pull it over the line. And it's okay to say that. Now, there are not many sales organizations where that is the way the organization works. I have been in one that worked that way, and I have to say we created far more business by people being open and unthreatened, because other people create positive suggestions as to how you might deal with challenges that you may not have thought of yourself. Okay, but now we were saying technology and people. So sorry, there's a slight lag. I've got another screen going here. Technology and people. How can we look at the relationship between the two? So your screen will update in a second. So there is this goes back to the 70s and 80s, believe it or not, but it's equally valid now. There's a model called the stages of concern model. And this is informed by it. The language is not exactly the same. But if you just sort of briefly read through these statements, and what you have is, if you introduce a new solution, these are classic questions that we ask ourselves. Now, for some people, they can get stuck at any one point. For example, step one, I haven't heard of this. What's it all about? Yeah, like no one's told me. By the way, that's an inclusion thing. Has someone been included in what's going on? Do they actually know what it is trying to be done? It's fairly typical for a major project to be all the things to be ironed out and then just dropped on an organization if one doesn't know what they're doing particularly well. And then suddenly you get all these people who are perceived to be resistant to change, but actually they don't really know what it is you're trying to achieve. What is the end objective? And you can run through these. And again, Katie, people will be able to get hold of these slides, won't they?
Yes, yep. It's been recorded and the slides will be published along with it, yes. Perfect.
But what I'd like to suggest is, where you ideally would like people is to hear, to be this point, how best can I collaborate with others and use this system effectively? Now, you will inevitably have people at different points. They're not bad people. They're just on a journey of understanding what is it that they can do and how this system can help them. There is, however, yes, another trap. It's a little bit like the innovation one, the challenger. This is a great system, but what else can we do? Again, let's introduce new capability because it's there, new toys. And I can confess to being one of those at certain points in my career. This is really not very helpful for people who are back here, who are in the early stages. So if we all have an understanding of the objective is to get as many people as we can, and it's for them to get there and for the organization to put in supporting structures to help them get there, because the more people you have in this second to last item, the better solution you're going to have in terms of collaboration and using that technology that you've deployed. And you end up getting the engagement. Most collaborative-based solutions have a utilization problem. They may have successfully sold licenses, but they haven't got full adoption. It's because they don't have people here. It's a very easy way of looking at it when you look at this structure. Now, important point. This is a nice conceptual model. There's people behind it. There's emotions behind every one of them. And for some reason, we have a tendency to put the emotions to one side. There's a saying in the UK, I'm so sad that I know it so well here, leave your emotions at home. Well, that's really effective, isn't it? So let's have part of the person turning up, knowing that emotions ultimately dictate an awful lot of what we do, but we're just denying that to ourselves and to our colleagues. No, emotions do turn up. And if we can talk about them in a way that enables us to understand the real issues, again, we stand a better chance of getting people to this right-hand edge. Finally, resistance to change in mindsets. I showed this to a technical group the other day, and they sort of recognized the number left one. I don't quite like, sorry, the one on the left. Well, we've always done it like this. It works, so don't change it. And again, a classic phrase that we probably all come across in our work or in other studies. And there's the work of Carol Dweck, who looks at fixed and growth mindsets. So we've got fixed mindset on the left and growth mindsets on the right. The left, the paraphrasing, it's really about, well, we know our limits and we should stick to them, versus actually with the way we as humans do things more effectively over time is we experiment, we learn, but organizational cultures that don't allow for that. So yeah, a really effective agile space is obviously, I would suggest, is obviously a growth mindset, not a fixed one. It's permanently adaptive. But no, at a personality, well, at an individual level is probably a better way of saying it. At an individual level, some people have a natural disposition to be one or the other. It's not about categorizing, it's a natural disposition. But if you put these other things we've been speaking about beforehand in the frame, actually it becomes more exciting to learn. It becomes safer to learn. You'll probably find someone with a fixed mindset has been beaten up for having a good idea once in their career. That happens way too often. Katie, I can see someone's waiting to come in.
Yeah, I've just admitted, yeah.
Great, thank you. So, try not to use these sort of labels as, oh, that person's X. Use it as, oh, I wonder why that person might be exhibiting those characteristics. What's going on behind the scenes? And use the other frameworks that we've been sharing to help unpick that with them. Now, there's a question mark as to how deep you can go, but the point is, again, if you know where the labels are, you can then choose if you want to do it yourself, learn about it yourself, get someone else to support you. There's many ways you can approach these things. Okay, so we're now summing up. We're going to get back to some more interaction. So thank you for bearing with me. So we've gone through at a high level, how do we process, what's the process of forming relationships? And the answer is inclusion, control, and openness, and it's recursive. How do we look at quantity and quality? You know the formula. It's not linear. It's not exponential either, actually, but it's a non-linear growth path. And how do you look at quality? -1, +1, +2, +3. Different levels of psychological safety. What we're after is contributor level safety, which means learning and inclusion is in place. Our personal relationship with technology. Know that people will engage with technology at different rates. There's a thing called assimilation demand. That's the rate at which we can take things in, and it's different for each of us. And it will be different for a person in a different context. Someone may rapidly take things in one context, put them in another context where they're less comfortable or less familiar, and their assimilation demand, the assimilation rate will be slower. So therefore the demand, the cognitive load will be greater. Therefore they get tired. Any of you who've engaged in adult education will probably know or recall that when you're into new space of learning, it can be quite tiring, but you're doing not much physically. So we know cognitive load can tire us. And then finding resistance to change, you know, try to hold the frame of mindsets of growth or fixed. Now, we actually have a completely different take on that. We go much deeper in another area, but that's not relevant for today. But you can get into what's called constructivism and vertical development, which is another lens you can bring into this whole topic of resistance to change. Okay.
Rod, just before you jump out, we had a question when you were talking around Tim Clark's psychological safety, and that was from Branka, who asks, could you give an example of when challenging can be counterproductive?
Yeah, let's assume that you have been spending a year or two bringing in together a new information system, and you've finally got what the organization needs, and you've got consensus, and now you've got this sort of introducing product or solution and then using product and solution. So while you're introducing, you want challenge because you don't want to be introducing something that's not going to work. So that's when you sort of say, well, yeah, please do challenge me, because help me understand if I've got any issues. But once it's in and once it's running, you need a period of running it. And so what I mean by that is, think of a car. You have to go through and design and build a car. But once a car is built, you want it just to run. You want to be able to get in the car and drive it, and it just carries on doing the same thing. You know why you bought the car. If you had a designer saying, oh, by the way, I can do a tweak here and a tweak there, I can change this bit of the car, it'd be great. And, oh, by the way, I'm going to change your heated rear mirror to something else. You don't want the challenger at that point. So it's very contextually relevant. So I think it will depend. So the answer to the question is, unfortunately, it depends, because it depends on the context you're in. I can imagine some situations where continual challenge is actually welcomed, where you have continual iteration. That would be fine. And the challenger and the comfort of being able to challenge would be fine. But there are other contexts. Implementing a global sales forecasting system. If you're trying to get 500 people to adopt a new system, you don't want to be changing that every now and again, because it's going to confuse people. So I think it's context related.
Okay. And then just quickly, a nice observation from Sheila when you were talking about the areas of concern and things getting dropped on people. She said if it's dropped on an organisation without inclusion, odds are it's also half-baked because the instigators had incomplete information or did not consider all factors. So thank you for that.
Yeah, and it's a lovely contribution. And I'd have to say, yes, I've seen one of those as well.
Yeah.
Cool. So what we're going to do now, how many people do we actually have online? We have 40, so that's great. I'm going to suggest, I'm going to share with you an approach we've created. This, by the way, you can engage in this later on as well. So this is available for you to use freely. So take note of the links we'll be giving out here. What we've done is we've tried to encapsulate elements of all the work we've just done now, the introduction we've gone through, into just 20 questions. And the idea is in 5 minutes, you can take an assessment to get a sense of where your group that you care about, you don't need to declare the group that you're thinking of, is, and benchmark it against others. So rather than me explain it, it's probably better that you experience it and then we discuss it. We've got enough time to enter into a discussion around the results, because I think it's otherwise we end up in a conceptual discussion rather than let's base it on some real numbers that are coming from the group. So that's what I'd like to suggest. And the real question going on here is, on the right-hand side, we've got a couple of traffic lights. And when you go through this, you'll get a PDF report. It's sent back to you personally, by the way. So each person gets their own PDF. And you're going to have 2 traffic lights, one at the top, one at the bottom, and they're either going to be green, amber, or red. Now, you also get the ability to look at, and this is where we can look at the whole group collectively, the what we call the 6 zones of collaboration. And this is based on norm data, where you can actually see where you are in relationship to other people. The classic, are you above average or below average? Now, part of me hates that because average is just an average. But an awful lot of people who haven't yet gone through that realization say, well, yeah, I'd like to know if I'm above or below. So we give people the ability to identify, are you above or below? But also not withholding the more meaningful content, which is the next level down. So let me go to this one. What I'm going to do is send you a link in a second. I'll send it through the chat. And what you'll see is a web form. And you've got name and email. By the way, I'd just like to assure you, we only use the email to send you the PDF report. It is never used for any marketing activity. So here, if you put your name and your email, the PDF report will be sent straight back to you. There's some other fields that you can fill in which are not in red. Feel free to do that if you wish. But what I would ask the group here on the call today is to actually add in the other group section the word Agile20Reflect. If for any reason you don't want to, don't worry, I should be able to deduce, but it would just be helpful because then we know categorically it's from this group. Once you've put name, email, and Agile20Reflect, you hit continue. You'll then be presented with 5 pages of questions. There is just total of 20 questions, sorry, 4 pages of questions, and then a closing slide where you then say, get my report. Now, let me show you something. Before you say, get my report, you will see 2 numbers on the left-hand side here. So if we follow the starting end of the arrows, in this example, you can see a 5.3 and a 4.0, and it's got a title, Environment Dynamic and Learning Dynamic. We tend to call that ED and LD. Before you hit Get Report, please take a note of your ED and LD numbers. Now, for those who don't want to share any details, you would actually need to put name and email in, but don't hit Get the Report, because that means your data then will not be submitted. So if you don't want to submit your data, you'll need to put it in initially to get past page 1, but then just abort and nothing will be submitted. But note, your data would not then go into the central database. If you don't mind about that, then please complete that data in, put in Agile20Reflect. Take note of these. The reason why I'm asking you to take note of them before you hit Get Report, just in case there's some delay in the report getting through the email system, because by taking note of it, you'll be able to participate in the next step. So you will get a report. Your report, by the way, will have these same numbers on it, but this is via the PDF, and that's why I'm just concerned to make sure it comes through to you. So grabbing it here helps you. And then what we're going to do is I'm going to send you a link now, which is going to be the link at the bottom here. So let me go and get that. I've got 2 PCs and I was typing on the wrong keyboard. Doesn't really work very well. Let's go and get this. So coming on the chat, and we've got, if we allow sort of 5 to 6 minutes, you should find that's plenty of time. But again, don't worry if I carry on after 6 minutes, don't worry, because I'm not going to do anything that's going to leave you too far behind. Right, URL coming through now.
Yeah, see that.
Great. Get my timer going. So just after 10 to, I'll come back.
This is where we should have had some soothing music in the background, Rod.
Can be arranged.
might distract people from their questions, though.
Yeah, it's really discover different tastes in music.
Yes.
I'm just going to ignore my screen for the moment, please. I'm just going to set something else up.
I think if anybody has just joined and wondering why there's this ghastly silence, if you have a look at the chat session, can I repost that, because people just joining won't be able to see it. So Roddy's just going to put a link in the chat, and that will enable you to have a look at these questions around the 6 zones of collaboration that people are currently filling in at the moment. Thanks, Rod. Rod being asked, do we put our output, the 2 numbers, in the chat?
No, don't need to, because we're going to do it via another Menti session, and we'll actually see it popping up. If people want to share that, feel free to do so, but we don't need to.
Thanks, Winona.
And for those of you who get the report, it should come back within about 60 seconds. Okay. Can we, Katie, is anyone getting a sense of how people are doing?
Not really.
Yeah.
Other than the people that have still got the cameras on are still looking at intent, but they could still be reading their emails.
Okay.
Euron, have you finished yet? All right, so Eckloff says good to go, done, finished. So people are coming up on chat saying yeah.
Okay,
thanks.
cool.
Yeah,
Excellent.
thank you, everybody.
Right, so I'll move on again. If you haven't yet completed, you carry on doing what you're doing, because I'm just going to be giving a bit of an intro as to how you can use this type of data, but then we'll move into actually using it together as a group. And we go through to 11:30. Is that correct, Katie?
Yes.
Yeah, that's fine. So we're doing well on time. So thank you, everyone that's gone through so far. Okay, now, one of the things I've noticed in using this type of approach is many people sort of will say, well, how can I use it in this context? Can I use it in that context? The classic, and in fact, that even happened to us last week on another session we're on the leadership group we were working on. Can you use these approaches in both open, i.e. groups of people that don't know each other or from different companies, or closed groups within a company? And the answer is yes, you just frame it appropriately. So I wanted to give you a sense, and I've just got a photograph against each of these, or an image or photograph against each of these statuses. And then we'll actually get on and look at our own data here as a group. So we've used this approach in auditorium settings with online follow-up. So in the days you could actually meet face-to-face, we had a face-to-face but auditorium type setup. and then with a follow-up, and you'll see why in a minute, why we did the online and auditorium. You can obviously use them in some form of face-to-face facilitation. So it's actually a classic type of thing that an Agile coach could be using. Online retrospectives, online data sharing and dashboards, and then finally online benchmarking and open group, which is what we're actually going through at the moment. So let's go and have a look just at each, and I'll explain a bit of background on these. So back in February, we were lucky enough to be invited to Auckland University of Technology, and there's an Agile meetup group that uses AUT. And this is a live session we were doing, and they weren't asking to go to the toilet, they were actually voting. And what we did is they all went through the question set, and we had a slightly different way of representing the data back in 2018. And we just had a show of hands for were you in zone, this region 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And you can see that we had a spread 2, 5, 14, 39, 26. And then we discussed in open forum what might that mean. Now, this is before we had a norms table, and with the norm table, we then were able to create more meaningful zones. Before they were just an equal division of the space. But a lot of the people here, so we were in Auckland, which is a lovely place to be in doing this. We live in the UK. People wanted some kind of follow-up. And it's like, okay, so we're in the UK, you're in Auckland, what do we do? And Mentimeter, which is the tool we've used today, we had come across probably only a few months beforehand at that point in 2018. And we actually used it as a way to gather follow-up where people wanted to reflect on a different group, go through the same process, and then each dot here in this graph, in this display, I'm not looking at my monitor. Oh, actually, Katie, yep. What I'm looking at and what you guys are looking at are different. That's inconvenient.
Okay. We're looking at one that's headed auditorium sessions.
Okay, right. My screen just took a while to update. So, so these individual dots on the bottom right-hand side, these individual dots represent a view of a person, and the center point is the epicenter or the mean for all these contributors. So this is a case of live auditorium session, interactive discussion, poster on the wall, playing with post-it notes, and no one coming down, be too many people coming down, but then following up online. Now, if we go to the next version, we then had face-to-face facilitation. It was about this time we then converted some of these into like card games and things, where this is in Czech Republic, a conference called Agile, where we're just using the same question bank. And the point being, these 20 questions have stood the test of time, that they're helping people explore those other 5 elements that we were talking about, or the 5 essential elements. Moving on, we then had the challenge, which is, but how do we do a really in-depth workshop, but no one could get together? And this happened to us round about beginning of COVID time, March last year, where we'd had a session with a group. We'd actually engaged in on the bottom left here, we'd engaged in a physical game as one of our data inputs, but we then thought, well, that's when we're all together. It'd be nice to gather the view of what we're independently. Do we have the same results when we're independent of each other versus when we're together? So they did the game bottom left, but then they did the right-hand side, which is what you guys have just gone through and processed. But then we thought, well, we want to be more interactive. And each of these images that you see here are actually A1 posters, but now put on a mural. And with this menu system on the right, you can just zoom in and explore whatever topic or card or statement you want to. So just another example of how you can move the 5 elements, the concept, into 20 questions, into a report, into a game, and then into interactive sessions online. Moving on. More recently, we were asked, can we actually integrate this into Microsoft Teams? So what we've got is a situation where people are completing the same profiles that you guys have been repeating. The data naturally feeds into, beyond the scope of this call, how we did that, but I'm very happy to talk to people about it. The data feeds automatically into a data set embedded in Microsoft Teams. And then for those of you who are familiar with pivot tables, we use pivot tables to slice and dice the data, and then we can present on dashboards. So again, we're just capturing 20 statements. Whatever we do, it's always the same 20 statements, because we want to, if the 5 elements we're working on are true, and if our 20 statements are true, then why would you worry about trying to do anything else? Focus on understanding these basics. So that's what we've done here, and that's been quite an interesting project to make that work as seamlessly as possible. So that's now in play. Let's come back to today. So what I'd like to do is I'm going to send you a new Menti code. For those of you who are quick to spot, that is the code at the top. So if you were to go back to Menti, close the session you were in if it's still open, go back to menti.com and type in that code. But I will also send out a link on the chat as I did before, which is a direct link to the new Menti. And the objective here, by the way, is to enter. See if I've got it here. No. Right, the objective here, you will see two fields to enter: the environment dynamic, ED, and the learning dynamic. And I'd like you to put the two numbers you took account of into the Menti, and then we'll start to see people's results. Let me send you the link. The chat window's vanished. There you go.
Yep, see it there. Thanks, Rod.
Okay, and I'll go to the live view so you can see this coming. Is that sharing?
Yes.
Oh, not yet.
Yeah, it's moving as well. Yeah.
Well, we've got some good stuff to talk about today.
Quite.
I'll talk to
just well before you go on. Kenny's got a question. You've got a hand up, Kenny. Do you want to ask? You're on mute at the moment.
Oh, yes, I just want to get a repeat of that code that was shown on the screen earlier on.
Okay, it's on the chat. If you go onto the chat window, the Menti code is there.
Okay,
but it's also at the top of the screen as well that you're looking at, 5261243.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, great.
what I find is quite amusing, Katie, is where the center point is relative to the norm.
Yeah. Yeah.
Life doesn't change much, does it?
No, I was going to say it's always very similar, isn't it? Yeah.
And I think when people are have done, if you can just in the chat use the I'm done, just so we get a sense of how many people have. I mean, at one level we can see, but I can't count that fast. I've
got 20 showing on Menti as done. Bottom right corner.
Oh, thank you, Katie. I hadn't spotted that. That's a little bit easier, isn't it?
Yeah. Got a lot going on, so I'll forgive you that one. Thanks, everybody.
Okay, so I think what we seem to have give it just another 30 seconds, and then we'll kick off and start discussing these results.
Yeah. So 22 in there now.
Okay. Well, let me start sharing the interpretation of the chart, because I think that becomes quite helpful. So we talk about the 6 zones of collaboration, and these zones, probably a true statistician would not like what I've done, but that's what challengers do, right? You do things that people don't like often. And what I wanted to do is I wanted to show the statistical bands of mean plus or minus 1 standard deviation plus or minus 2 standard deviations based on our norm group, but for 2 axes together. And if you're not into stats, don't worry. And I'll share with you what the high level take is. This line here, which is just under 6 for the vertical scale. So there's a delay on my mouse, I'm afraid. So if you count 6 vertically going up, you've got the horizontal dark line, that's 5, go up 1. And if you come across to the right, you can see the shading changes. That is the mean point for the learning dynamic score. Now, if we now look from left to right, so we're now looking on the environment dynamic. Again, if you come to the middle dark vertical line, that's 5, that's the midpoint. But the actual mean, if you look higher up and you see the shading change, the shading changes is roughly 5.5. That is the mean point for the environment dynamic. So what we've said is, when the environment dynamic and learning dynamic are at the mean point, that is the creation of what we call zone 4. When the environment and learning dynamic are +1 standard deviation on the scores, then that's the next shaded area, which is zone 5. And then zone 6 is 2 standard deviations up. And then if you come back the other way, if you go to the left and right bottom corner of zone 3, that's the mean point -1 or -1 standard deviation, and zone 2 is -2 standard deviations. Relevance being mean point plus or -1 standard deviation is about 68% of any normalized population. So what that says is anyone with dots, where you see the big one, which is the mean point, by the way, of this group, it's almost perfectly on top of, not quite, of the corner point of zone 4 intersecting zone 3. That is the midpoint of the norm group. So you guys, I'm now going to play with words, are really, as an average, in the norm space. What's interesting now, though, is notice if all we were looking at was the average of the group, we'd say, okay, we've got an average group. We'd miss the potency and the reality of what's going on in the bottom left area and the top right area. And what I mean by that is, I'm going to, well, I tell you what, I'm going to ask people, and do this in the chat if you might, and do it in an anonymized format if you prefer. You don't need to declare the group you're thinking about. Can you just throw some words out in the chat for those of you who've scored in the bottom left-hand area, some words that characterize this group you were thinking about? Any words you like. So go to the chat, and it's people in the bottom left quadrant. So zone 1, zone 2 primarily. And just throw in any words in the chat in the Zoom session.
Poor communication from Joanne. No clear vision. Shooting the messenger.
Unfortunately, I think we all experienced that. Okay, now let's do a switch. Those who are in the zone 5 or almost in zone 5, could you just share some words on the chat again? And we'll open this up for a discussion in a minute, Katie.
Yeah, so still in the zone 1, we've got discouraging and draining, no interest in different opinions.
Okay, so we've now got entrepreneurial, challenging, spark ideas of each other.
Collaborative. Okay.
Now, and then the thing I would just like to say is, as you look at this and you think, most organizations would say we would like high performing teams. That's a lovely bit of hype, right? Let's all have high performing teams. Yeah, okay. So how do you create high performing teams? Well, first of all, you need to have people who know how to work to each other with the right skill set for the right task. And they need to have an environment that allows them to excel. Now, before we open up the chat, I just want to share one thing. It hasn't occurred much in this session, but in other sessions, and Katie's seen this before. The top left-hand box, so that would be high learning dynamic and low environment dynamic. So my mouse, I've got a real lag on my PC, I'm afraid, but if we had people who were, you can see my mouse pointer, it's in this general area. It's not moving much, but my mouse pointer is on the left-hand side in the upper area. Now, you have some groups who are up there. And what that represents is, within the group, it actually works really well, in spite of the organization they are operating within. And I've raised that particularly because I've noticed this with certain Agile groups, that within the people who are being Agile, not just trying to do it, but are being it in a group, sometimes they've managed to be so strong as a group, but they're actually outpacing the capability and the way of thinking and being for the rest of the organization. So they are high performing in spite of the organization. Now, the problem is that erodes over time. You can only keep that for a certain period of time. My experience has been maybe 5 years is the period. If once the group becomes aware it's an organization that doesn't understand their value, they have a self-generated purpose, autonomy and mastery at play, but over time it gets eroded, it gets worn down. So watch out for those in the upper left. That means the group itself is doing quite well, but the environment is likely to snuff it out. You generally get, though, the more typical is this bottom left to top right banding. I think at this point, Katie, I'm happy that we open up for any questions from the group. Have you got any via the Q&A or chat at the moment that we need to field, or should we go to audio?
No, well, we've got just one from Michael, which goes back to, can you give an example of how the quality of relationship could move from a -1 to say a +2?
Yeah, well, first of all, it'll have to go through the +1. And yes, I can. So I was in a high-tech company, and actually this relationship was with my manager. And I would have to say my manager, he was in Boston, I happened to be in the UK, and we absolutely had a -1 relationship. And it was a classic micromanagement. I'd get phone calls. I would be being blamed for all sorts of things that were just inappropriate to blame anyone for. You know, why did we lose these sales when I actually wasn't even in the sales department? And he was blaming me. So I happened to be the target. He happened to be the protagonist. So classic sort of attack type relationship. And I personally got so frustrated with it that I formally complained to HR, knowing that that could be a career limiting strategy. What happened was it turned out that 5 other people had also complained. What that then did is this person was then brought in by HR and informed that there's an issue. What then happened was really interesting. We then all met and we shared what it was that was giving us grief. Now, I believe it or not, he thought he was supporting us. So this individual's belief of what support was so out of kilter or out of alignment with what the recipients believed was support that he would do more of it to help us, but he wasn't. And when he realized what he was doing, and this is about awareness, when he realized what he was doing was actually causing the opposite, we then recontracted, as in psychological contract, how could we work together as peers? I mean, ultimately, he still had the role of the and accountability of being the global manager, but we agreed how would we operate, and we shifted from what clearly was a -1 because people were prepared to walk out the door to a +1. It moved to a pure functional relationship. So that's the +1 space. Once you're in the +1 space, at least you have organizationally a working relationship. Definition being working relationship. Now, on certain topics, because of the damage of the -1, it was clear with some people that would never ever evolve into a +2. Trust had been broken, respect had been hurt, but people trust had been hurt and respect wasn't there. But over time, as the +1 was seen to be stable, and the question is it stable even in times of stress? And when it turned out to be, then 1 or 2 people saw, oh, actually, the issue was this guy just didn't understand himself at the time. And if you're familiar with that concept of someone doesn't understand themselves and the self-awareness topic, it's amazing how much more open you can be to accommodating someone. And under certain situations, a +2 or glimmers of a +2 can happen. I would say, though, that no one really got to a +2 with that individual. I think both parties want to have to be a +2. There has to be in their desire, but it comes over time. It's the inclusion, control, and openness. If there's an imbalance in inclusion, control, and openness, you'll never get to a +2. It just won't happen.
Thank you.
Thanks.
You're welcome. Right. Katie, I think I'm happy that we just open this up now audio wise, and anyone asks a question and we field it, because we've got some really rich information here. I can talk more about it, but I'd rather get people's input and respond to specific questions if I can.
Okay, over to the audience. Anybody want to ask any questions of Rod?
Or share a report, by the way.
Yeah.
Well, I would have a question, Rod. This is Winona speaking from Brussels. Hi. I'm working as an Agile coach, and I think the environment that we're in is really on the right-hand side of the graph, but we definitely have teams still after a couple of years who are very low on the learning dynamics score.
Yeah.
Would you have any tips or tricks on what to do next?
Sure. Did you get a PDF report for yours?
Yes, but I actually, what I used was the Agile Coach community, and we're really high up on the right top.
Okay, understood. So, well, let me share it in the context of the report, because that would be part of that, the method. And I've just realized I haven't got that ready to share. Bear with me 1 second. Okay. Let me just go and get that, because it'll be easier if I talk about how you could use the report. You do all this preparation and you manage to forget one, don't you? Well, I did anyway. I'll just get the report up. Dropbox. Right, this is just so I'm going to share one of the reports, and it is it's a sample one that I've used, so it's not real data, just one I've created to play with here. Let me share that. Okay, it's not playing. I think I'm going to have to stop sharing and share again, Katie. I'm going to try to add it, but it's not allowing me to. Oh, I've got it now. Here we go. Took a while to update.
There you go.
Let's go to, right. Hopefully, are you now seeing a PDF?
Yep, I can see that.
Okay. So what you have here, for that group, well, no, what I suggest you do is just go and do that profile again. But this time, because by the way, this profile is free to take in the PDF. It's just one of the things we're giving back into the community. So just go and take it again, but this time put in the data relevant to the different teams that you're thinking of, because you mentioned some teams are actually working already well, and others may not be. And what's really helpful, although you can benchmark against our data, it's really helpful to be able to benchmark against your own data. So I would go pick 2 or 3 of what you would refer to as your top teams who are getting on really well internally, and just bring to mind that group, complete the profile, then repeat with another group, and do this with as many groups as you like. And you'll start to see a pattern of what good is through the lens of these 20 questions. What you then do is you then do the repeating exercise, but for then the groups that you want to support to help them move forward. What you'll then do is you'll then compare the traffic lights. The traffic lights, what you effectively have with traffic lights is the red means lower than -1 standard deviation from the norm. The amber is plus or minus 1 standard deviation around the norm. And the green is greater than +1. So instinctively, I would expect that the strong groups you've mentioned will both be green lighting. When you go to the more problematic ones, or the ones that haven't quite got there yet, probably you'll find that learning dynamic, sorry, the around the group, the environment dynamic will be still green, but you'll find that the group one is either going to be amber or red. Now, what happens is this text changes depending on the type of the color traffic light that pops up. And there's sort of some clues going on in this as to what you might want to look for. So that's the first step I would go to, just so that you've got an internal comparison. You've got to use the comparison carefully, obviously, because if the organization really is strong in environment dynamics, there's very low risk of it being abused. But I've even seen organizations that on the face of it are great, but still end up using data inappropriately because maybe one person hasn't quite understood what's going on. Now, that's the first place I would start. Now, the second, here, this is where you have your results. So you can now, on one plot, put multiple marks representing the different groups. So again, you can see them visually together. But on the report, I don't know if you can see, let me zoom in a bit. We've got some very high-level characterization going on here about the characteristics of these different zones. So that's, again, a way of introducing this, because I'm going to give you a radical thought in a minute, but I'm just sort of getting you there slowly. And I'm taking the time here because I think your question is very relevant for maybe other people on the call. this is just the above and below average of the means, and it's either green or red depending on the scores. Now, this is actually ultimately what I wanted to get you to. There are 20 questions asked, and we have 20 labels. And so these labels don't take the words as literal. They're just labels to the statements that you've responded to. But you can see the scores going on. But the purpose of the labels is to give you an indication of what's being explored. So not precisely, but the indication of what's being explored. So you will find within your groups, when you look at your stronger groups, you're going to see a spread of numbers here and the learning dynamic is this top group, and the environment dynamic is this bottom group. And what you'll see is a spread of numbers. Now, the interesting thing is to look for patterns. Are there patterns between the high performing and the low performing? Because it's not about one number. It's about the 10 characteristics at play within the group. Now, do you remember we spoke about inclusion, control, and openness? The questions relating to these first two are around inclusion. Which, hang on, I think my route's wrong way around. They're paired, and I can't remember the pairing at the moment. I have to just double check. The pairing is inclusion has 2 of these statements, control has another 2, openness has another 2. Then we have what we call group outcomes, and then we have group prospects. So in fact, it is this. So we've got many views and a collective view. So that's the inclusion. Then the control is about asking and collaborating. The openness trust is about openness. The last but one pair is about group outcomes. You know, is there understanding? In classic cases, do people understand each other in this group? Or is there a lot of misunderstanding? And then do people feel, and this is their own personal view, by the way, an enhanced work-life quality? We don't put balance deliberately. Do they feel work-life quality is increased or not? Because you remember we mentioned right at the beginning, people do bring their feelings to work, even though we pretend sometimes they don't. Some of the challenges going on in those groups may be due to the individual personal systems going on for those individuals. Might be something outside of work that's causing it, because you can never stop that 100%. And actually, I don't think you ever want to. So by looking at this level, which is the granular level 2, so the learning dynamic, you have one number. All that is an average of these numbers, okay? And the scale is from 1 to 10 on each of these. So look for the pattern, and then see if you've got a pattern of really strong and and midpoint in your good groups, or good groups in quotes, and then on the problematic ones, or the ones that still need learning and they haven't quite got to where you would like them, where is the pattern? Because you may find some of the high points are common. And this then allows you to say, well, is it I need to focus on the relationship side, which would be, if you've got issues going on in any one of the first 6 here, that's directly to do with interpersonal relationships. So there's a support that the the group may need in terms of understanding each other. Now, if the group has an awareness that it's not doing as well as others and would like to, but doesn't know how to, which is a really interesting position. Some groups are just not aware that they're not where they could ideally be. If there's an awareness, I wish we could be stronger, but we just don't know how to be. Then the other thing you can do is use this exact same process with the group. You have each group, because if you remember the questions, we're not asking people to judge themselves. They're making a judgment call and a score based on the group that they are a member of. So you can do it, first of all, from your perspective, but note your perspective, just like everyone else's unique perspective, has blind spots. And this is not a critique on your good self, because I don't know you, but I guarantee I have blind spots. So part of why you would solicit more than one person's input, i.e. the group members, is the most powerful one, is because you get people's own view about the group they're a member of. And you'll be amazed at the variation. So the variation we saw on that chart, normally within a group, so a homogeneous group looking at itself, you wouldn't normally get as big a spread, but I have seen maybe people from zone 2 to zone 5 in the same group thinking about the same group. So again, it's about what do people really see in their group? And the whole concept of this is give a psychological safe way, so it's modeled in the way we've done this, for people to explore any group, even one they belong to. So a long explanation, but I think very relevant for this session. So thank you for the question.
Thank you very much, Rod. This was very, very helpful.
All right. I'm just picking up a little bit of background noise. Could I just ask people to put themselves on mute unless you're asking a question? And I think maybe just one final question that we have is, do you think that the country-specific culture influences collaboration level?
Wow, fascinating. So my personal experience is, you can go philosophical on this one. Yes.
Please don't. Not at 25 past.
That's okay. Well, the answer is yes. That's I was asked. So sort of a closed question, closed answer. Yes. If you look at how certain cultures seem to be naturally inclined to collaborate, they do also, and I'm going to say the Netherlands now, I have seen in the Netherlands certain groups that excel in their ability to collaborate. And that's just a personal observation. I've seen not many who I would classify as excelling in the UK. Now, I don't want to make it about nationalism, but if you go back to the formation of the countries, it's actually almost in the constitution of the formation of the nations. You know, the Netherlands came together. My history is not brilliant, but I know it came together in a very different way to the UK. And I think that influences the national culture. It influences how people see the space between others. Is it about me winning and you losing? You know, the UK tends to have a win-lose attitude, I'm afraid, which I find very frustrating. It's even embedded in the legal system. You know, you cannot have an amicable settlement in court, with the exception, by the way, of a divorce, which is irony, really. So in court, you must have a winner and a loser. And the only way you have a mutual agreement is if you settle out of court. So in the UK legal system, we don't look for truth, we look for winners and losers. I think if you go on to the continent of Europe, you'll find many of the legal systems there are more about trying to get to the truth, what actually is happening, rather than who's the winner and who's the loser. And so wherever you have legal systems that are built or similar to the UK one, which is effectively an adversarial, that's the actual term within the legal system itself. It's an adversarial legal system because you only have a winner and a loser. Now imagine trying to do negotiations to try and come up with an agreeable solution for two parties, but you can only have one loser and one winner. That's a little bit challenging. So it's embedded in some of the culture at such a deep level that I think we're influenced by it, but don't know it's there. Sorry, Katie, I went on to philosophy.
That's all right. I think people are agreeing with you in the chat that yes, that different cultures do make a difference, and really for all sorts of different ways. And I'm very sorry, but we can't unpack that at this stage.
But one thing to share. I think the fundamentals of the questions that we're asking, the language may be a bit difficult by the time it gets converted around. I've even had people critique me in English on it. I know technically it's correct on English, but I think the lens that we provide here works internationally. How you engage with what you see and if you like, the follow-on actions to help a group move forward is going to be extremely contextually relevant and culturally relevant. So you need to have those in mind as you look at the next stage. But if you look at this as just a tool, it's just an instrument to help you put a frame of reference based on standard human elements. So if I go back to the, I should just better go back to my presentation, shouldn't I? If I go back to,
I was just going to say we got a final slide.
Yeah, we do. So bang, bang. Right, I've got lots of stuff on my screen. So if you go back to these, I believe these to be universal. And why do I have that confidence? Because some of the Deming work is, this isn't aligned, well, it's not aligned, but it's similar to Deming's work. His actually came out primarily from Japan, but worked equally in America and across Europe. So these are human aspects. So these, I think, are less culturally specific. These are human characteristics. And my final slide, if it works, come on, go back. I want to go there. Feel free, if anyone wants to reach out, I'm very happy to share and point at references I use. We've got quite a lot of stuff on websites, which is generally available for free. We've even got 8 hours of training, which is free as well, online. But this is really about sharing the 5 elements. But if you have an interest, or this topic sort of has inspired you or got some questions, do feel free to reach out. I'm very happy to just bounce ideas or signpost other stuff I'm familiar with.
Okay. All right. Thanks very much for that, Rod. Lots of people coming through saying thank you also on the chat. Very informative. Continue learning. Really interesting. Thank you. So collectively, from everybody, Rod, thank you very much. Certainly lots of information there, lots of food for thought, and thank you so much. This recording will be made available both on the Consortium's website and also on the Agile20Reflect Festival's archive. So if there's any of those kind of references you want to come back to, then please have a look there. So give us a couple of days to sort that out. So thank you very much, everybody, also for being interactive and joining in and getting involved. And with that, thank you. I'm just going to close.